Alright, welcome back everyone. I'm going to try to keep this one as short as possible, so I'm going to jump right into it. A couple years ago, I salvaged this table from a really old travel trailer. Now the size of this thing is actually perfect for my needs, but it's ugly as stink and quite heavy, so I won't be using it in a boat. However, what I'm really interested in here is the hardware, which will allow the table to collapse and turn the seating area into a platform, which then can be used as a bed. Now if you follow the channel, then you know that I have already a bed tucked away under the ceiling, but this could be used for a guest.
Now the easiest would be to take a nice piece of 3/4 inch plywood, put a nice edge on it and some varnish, and boom, you're done. Well, as you know by now, I like to make my life very difficult, and I didn't make an exception on this one. There were two things that I wanted to accomplish that made this table a bit tricky. First, I not only wanted to match the look with the kitchen countertop, but I also wanted to integrate some of the design elements that are used on the stairs. Well, and then it had to be as lightweight as possible and yet still strong enough to support some serious weight.
To start this project, I cut this 1/4 inch piece of plywood into the size that I wanted for the table surface. Now this will be the base for the design. I still had a lot of scrap pieces of Douglas fir left. I just had to make sure they're all exactly the same size. Since years I have this block of mahogany kicking around, and I decided it is time to do something with it. Now the plan was to cut it in really thin strips with the same thickness as those diamond-shaped Douglas fir pieces. I then used some wood glue and masking tape to glue those strips along the edges. Now this will add a layer of complexity to the design, and it will make it a lot more interesting to look at. I felt though this could use a stronger contrast in color. Unfortunately, I didn't have any dark colored wood kicking around, so I used thick black paper instead. I cut it in thin strips first and then glued 2 layers on the edge. Believe it or not, this took solid 9 hours just to get to this point. For a couple months now I have this old hardwood flooring kicking around. It has been exposed to the outside for a year or two, and some fungi caused this beautiful coloration. This piece in particular caught my attention, so I sliced a 3-inch wide strip on the table saw, glued some mahogany strips on it as well, and I used it as a centerpiece. Well, now a long glue process was set in motion, and it took days to get every piece in its place. Well, here I'm using my all-time favorite tool, the Oscillating multi-tool, to cut the majority of the overhanging strips. Now for the rest I used the cordless router with a flush cut trim bit that has a bearing at the top. And this way you get a really clean edge, and it follows exactly the shape of the plywood. Now it doesn't happen very often that I pull out my belt sander, but this was the perfect situation for it. It turns out using just those weights is not enough clamping pressure, and here and there I had a slightly raised corner throughout the whole piece. Luckily the belt sander didn't need long to flatten everything. Next I cut a second piece of 1/4 inch plywood, same size, and I started to cut framing material from scrap wood, and I glued it in place. The plan here is to build a beefy looking 2-inch thick tabletop. Now if I would use a solid wood, this would be ridiculously heavy, so by building this hollow core, I get the solid look and the lightweight. Now a couple pieces of dowels help to keep the plywood from warping between the framing. Now I could marry both pieces together. To keep this as flat as possible, I did the glue up on the kitchen countertop. And this time I used as many clamps wherever I could, but I was still forced to use weights for most of it. Thankfully it worked out this time. To be honest with you, I had small gaps between the pieces pretty much everywhere, so I used some epoxy to fill them up. It actually doesn't really bother me when it comes to the aesthetics, but it would bother me big time to feel them. Sadly, this turned the already much hated job of sanding the surface into a nightmare that lasted a couple hours, but I got it done eventually. Yet again, I'm using the cordless router with the same bit and a template to cut out the pockets for the hardware. Well, and then I finally could apply the first coat of finish, and this step is always very exciting. You finally get to see the beauty of the grain. And by the way, I used birch to fill in the background, and I just love how it always pops up with this really warm golden color. Now after 4 coats with light sanding in between, I installed the aluminum edge, which perfectly matches the countertop. And I purposely let it overhang at the back of the table, and this way I could cut it exactly on spot. And again, the oscillating multi-tool is doing a great job with those kinds of flush cuts. You just have to make sure your blade is rated for metal. I will try to put some links to the tools that are used in this project in the video description. Now the only thing that was left is to install the hardware, and as you can see I painted some of it white to make it a little bit more invisible. And that finally wrapped up the build of this table.